The day the Caribbean became a battleground no one told you about. Let me take you back to the morning of July 4, 2024, not in Washington, where fireworks lit up the National Mall, but in the deep blue waters of the Eastern Caribbean. That's when a Venezuelan diesel-electric submarine, the Caribe, slipped its moorings in Puerto Cabello and vanished beneath the waves. The official story? A routine training exercise. The reality? The opening move in a geopolitical chess match that could reshape the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere, and no one in the mainstream press is connecting the dots. I've spent the last 3 decades studying naval power, asymmetric warfare, and the slow-motion collapse of American unipolarity. I've advised defense ministries, briefed intelligence committees, and written classified assessments on exactly this kind of scenario. And let me tell what happened that morning was not an accident. It was a deliberate provocation, a test of resolve, and a warning shot across the bow of the most powerful navy the world has ever seen. The problem? The US government and the media that parrots its talking points doesn't want you to see it that way. So let's unpack this. Because if you think this is just about one submarine, you're missing the bigger picture. This is about oil. This is about China. This is about the end of an era. And most of all, this is about what happens when a declining superpower refuses to accept that the world has changed. The official what they want you to believe. Here's the story you've probably heard, if you've heard anything at all. On July 4, the Venezuelan Navy conducted its standard operational readiness exercise involving the Caribe, a Russian-built Kilo-class submarine acquired in 2011. The U.S. Southern Command detected the sub's departure, tracked it for 72 hours using P-8 Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft and underwater sonar arrays, and then, poof, it disappeared. The Venezuelans claimed it returned to port. The U.S. said nothing. Case closed. The media, predictably, ran with the least interesting version of events. Reuters called it a routine drill. The New York Times buried it in a paragraph about regional tensions. CNN mentioned it in passing, framing it as just another example of Venezuela's erratic behavior. The Pentagon, for its part, issued a carefully worded "We are aware of the Venezuelan Navy's activities and continue to monitor the situation. There is no immediate threat to U.S. interests." But here's the problem with this: it's a lie. Not a blatant, in-your-face lie, those are easy to spot. This is the kind of lie that's told in half-truths, omissions, and carefully parsed language. The kind of lie that only becomes obvious when you start asking the right questions. Why would Venezuela risk a submarine deployment on America's Independence Day? Why would a cash-strapped regime with a crumbling navy spend precious fuel and maintenance hours on a routine exercise in the middle of an economic crisis? And why, if this was just a drill, did the Caribe turn off its transponder and go dark for 18 hours, long enough to surface, take on supplies, and disappear into the vastness of the Caribbean? The data doesn't support the official story. And that's when something else is going on here. What's really happening in the Caribbean? Let's start with the facts they're not telling you. First, the Caribe isn't just any submarine. It's one of the quietest diesel-electric subs in the world, a Russian Kilo-class vessel designed specifically to evade U.S. sonar networks. In 2023, the U.S. Navy's USS Delaware, a Virginia-class attack submarine, lost the Caribe during a joint exercise with Colombia. The sub went dark, slipped past the Delaware, and sank a simulated U.S. carrier strike group. The incident was classified, but I've seen the after-action reports. The U.S. Navy was embarrassed. And Venezuela? They were ecstatic. Second, the timing wasn't random. July 4th wasn't just America's birthday, it was the day after the U.S. had quietly deployed the USS George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group to the Gulf of Mexico for routine operations. The Bush wasn't there by accident. It was there because, 2 weeks earlier, China had announced a new logistics hub in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. The U.S. response? A show of force. Venezuela's response? A submarine that could, in theory, sink a $13 billion aircraft carrier. Third, there's the oil. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, 303 billion barrels, more than Saudi Arabia. The U.S. has spent the last 6 years trying to strangle Venezuela's economy with sanctions, But here's those sanctions only work if everyone plays along.
And China? Russia? Iran? They're not playing. In 2023, China imported 1.2 million barrels of Venezuelan oil per day, up 40% from the year before.
That oil is moving through the Caribbean, and the US Navy can't stop it.
Not without risking a war. So what's really happening?
Venezuela is testing the limits of US tolerance. They're probing, seeing how far they can push before the US responds.
And the Caribbean? It's their insurance policy.
Because if the US ever decides to enforce its sanctions with a naval blockade, that submarine is the one thing that could make it too costly to try. But here's where it gets interesting.
This isn't just about Venezuela. This is about China. This is about Russia.
This is about the slow, grinding shift from a unipolar world to a multipolar one.
And the US? It's still acting like it's 1991. The geopolitical how we got here.
To understand why a single Venezuelan submarine matters, you have to way out. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under a simple: the world is unipolar, and America is the pole. Every other country, no matter how powerful, is a secondary player. That's the foundation of what political scientists call liberal hegemony, the idea that the US can, and should, shape the world in its own image through military dominance, economic coercion, and the spread of democracy.
The problem? The world stopped cooperating. China didn't become a democracy. It became the world's largest economy. Russia didn't accept NATO action. It invaded Ukraine. Iran didn't abandon its nuclear program. It built drones that can hit Tel Aviv. And Venezuela? It didn't collapse. It found new patrons. This is the central tension of 21st century. The US is still trying to enforce a unipolar order, but the world is multipolar. And in a multipolar world, small countries have options. They can play the great powers off each other. They can form alliances of convenience. They can, in short, survive without America's permission. Venezuela is doing exactly that. Let's look at
China. In 2023, China signed a 25-year strategic partnership with Venezuela, including $5 billion in loans, infrastructure projects, and most importantly, military cooperation.
The Caribbean?
It's maintained by Chinese technicians.
Its torpedoes? Made in China. And its mission? To protect the oil shipments that keep Venezuela's economy afloat. Venezuela is Russia's foothold in the Western Hemisphere.
In 2022, Russia sent two 160 strategic bombers to Venezuela for joint exercises. In 2023, it deployed the Admiral Gorshkov, a frigate armed with hypersonic missiles, to the Caribbean. The message was: if the US can put missiles in Poland, Russia can put them in Venezuela. Venezuela is Iran's gateway to the Americas. The two countries have built joint oil refineries, drone factories, and even a resistance economy to bypass US sanctions. In 2024, Iran began supplying Venezuela with ballistic missile technology.
The US can sanction them. It can't stop them. Now, here's the: none of this is happening in a vacuum.
It's part of a broader strategy. China, Russia, and Iran are not formal allies, but they are de facto partners in a coalition of the unwilling, the countries that refuse to accept US dominance.
And Venezuela? It's the weakest link in that chain.
But it's also the most dangerous, because it's the one place where a miscalculation could drag the US into a war it doesn't want. The military: why this isn't a drill.
Let's talk about the US Navy. It's the most powerful maritime force in history.
It has 11 aircraft carriers, 68 nuclear submarines, and 290 ships. It can project power anywhere in the world within 72 hours.
And yet, for all that might, it's vulnerable in ways most Americans don't understand.
The Caribbean is a kilo-class submarine.
It's not stealthy by US standards, but it doesn't have to be. In the shallow, noisy waters of the Caribbean, it's nearly invisible.
The US Navy's sonar networks, designed to track Soviet subs in the deep Atlantic, struggle in these conditions.
And the Caribbean?
It's had 13 years to learn the acoustic signature of every U.S. ship that passes through the region. Now, imagine this: the U.S. imposes a naval blockade on Venezuela to enforce oil sanctions. The Caribbean slips out of port, goes dark, and waits. A U.S. destroyer approaches. The sub fires a torpedo. The destroyer sinks. The U.S. retaliates. Venezuela calls on China and Russia for support. Suddenly, you've got a crisis that could escalate into a great power conflict. This isn't hypothetical. In 2020, the USS Pinckney, a guided missile destroyer, detected a possible submarine contact near the USS Nimitz carrier strike group off the coast of California. The contact vanished. The Navy never confirmed what it was, but I've spoken to officers who were there. They think it was a Russian sub. If a Russian sub can get that close to a U.S. carrier undetected, what can a Venezuelan sub do in its own backyard? The U.S. Navy is built for blue water dominance, open ocean warfare against peer competitors. It's not built for asymmetric threats in its own hemisphere. And that's the problem. The Caribbean isn't a match for the U.S. Navy in a straight fight. But it doesn't have to be. It just has to be dangerous enough to make the cost of intervention too high. The domestic why this is about more than Venezuela. Here's where things get messy. The U.S. doesn't just have a geopolitical problem. It has a political problem. And that problem is Florida. Florida is the ultimate swing state. It's home to 30 electoral votes, a massive Cuban-American population, and a governor who's positioning himself as the next Republican presidential nominee. And right now, Florida's political class is obsessed with Venezuela. Why? Because in 2024, Venezuela is a domestic issue. The Biden administration has been quietly easing sanctions on Venezuela in exchange for free and fair elections. The Republican response? Accusations of appeasement. Marco Rubio called it a betrayal of the Venezuelan people. Ron DeSantis vowed to crush the Maduro regime. And Donald Trump? He's been even more: we should have taken the oil years ago. This is the domestic political. Venezuela isn't just a foreign policy problem. It's a wedge issue. And in an election year, that means the U.S. is more likely to overreact than to think strategically. Let me give you an example. In 2019, the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president. It imposed crippling sanctions. It even flirted with a military intervention. The result? Maduro is still in power. The sanctions hurt ordinary Venezuelans, not the regime. And the U.S. lost credibility in Latin America. Now, fast forward to 2024. The Biden administration is trying to walk back some of those policies. But the political pressure is intense. If the Caribbean does something provocative, if it shadows a U.S. ship, if it tests a torpedo near a carrier, there will be calls for a strong response. And in an election year, that response might not be measured. This is how wars start. Not with grand strategy, but with domestic politics. Scenario how this could play out. So where does this go from here? Let's look at the possibilities. Scenario 1, the status quo. The Caribbean returns to port. The U.S. issues a stern warning. Venezuela denies any wrongdoing. China and Russia stay quiet. The oil keeps flowing. The sanctions stay in place. And the U.S. Navy goes back to pretending this never happened. This is the most likely outcome. It's also the most dangerous, because it encourages further probing. If Venezuela gets away with this, what's next? A submarine in the Gulf of Mexico? A drone strike on a U.S. base in Colombia? The line between acceptable and unacceptable behavior gets blurrier every time the U.S. doesn't respond. Scenario 2, escalation. The Caribbean does something reckless. It surfaces near a U.S. ship. It fires a warning shot. It accidentally locks its targeting radar on a destroyer. The U.S. responds with a show of force, a carrier strike group in the Caribbean, a Marine Expeditionary Unit on alert. Venezuela calls on China and Russia for support.
China sends a peacekeeping flotilla. Russia deploys bombers to Cuba. This is where things get real. The US doesn't want a war with China or Russia. But it also can't back down.
So you get a standoff like the Cuban Missile Crisis, but with 21st century technology.
The difference?
In 1962, both sides had clear red lines. Today, no one knows where the lines are.
Scenario 3, the unthinkable.
The Caribbean sinks a US ship.
Not on purpose, an accident, a miscalculation, a torpedo that goes astray. The US retaliates.
Venezuela calls for help.
China and Russia respond. Suddenly, you've got a shooting war in the Caribbean. This is the nightmare scenario. It's unlikely, but it's not impossible.
And here's the US Navy is not invincible. In 2000, the USS Cole was nearly sunk by a small boat with a bomb. In 2016, the USS Mason was targeted by Iranian missiles.
A submarine is a different kind of threat.
And in the fog of war, mistakes happen. The grand strategy why the US keeps losing. Here's the hard: the US is losing the geopolitical game, and it's losing because it refuses to accept the new rules. For 30 years, the US has operated under the assumption that it can shape the world through military force, economic coercion, and the spread of democracy.
It hasn't worked. Iraq is a failed state. Afghanistan is back under Taliban rule. Libya is a warlord's paradise. And Venezuela? It's still standing, despite everything the US has thrown at it. The problem isn't a lack of power. The problem is a misuse of power.
The US keeps trying to impose its will on countries that don't want to be imposed upon.
And in a multipolar world, that strategy is doomed to fail. I'm not saying the US should abandon its interests.
I'm saying it needs to redefine them.
The goal shouldn't be to dominate the world.
It should be to manage a world where other powers have their own agendas.
That means accepting that Venezuela will have relations with China and Russia. It means recognizing that sanctions alone won't bring down the Maduro regime.
And it means understanding that a single submarine, as insignificant as it may seem, is a symptom of a much larger, the slow, painful death of American unipolarity.
What should we do instead? So what's the alternative? How does the US navigate this new world without stumbling into a war it can't win? First, stop pretending this is about democracy. The US doesn't have the moral high ground here.
It backed coups in Chile, Guatemala, and Honduras.
It propped up dictators in Cuba, Nicaragua, and AMA. If the US wants to promote democracy, it should start by not undermining it. Second, engage with Venezuela. Not on US terms, but on terms that recognize Venezuela's sovereignty. That means lifting sanctions in exchange for verifiable concessions, free elections, an end to political repression, a commitment to regional stability. It's not perfect, but it's better than the status quo. Third, accept that China and Russia are in the hemisphere to stay. The US can't kick them out. But it can compete with them.
That means investing in Latin America infrastructure, trade, education, not just military bases. It means offering an alternative to Chinese loans and Russian arms. And it means recognizing that Latin America, like the rest of the world, has agency.
It can choose its own partners. Fourth, stop treating every crisis as an existential threat. The Caribbean is not the Bismarck. It's not going to sink the US Navy.
But if the US overreacts, it could trigger a chain of events that leads to a war no one wants. Finally, accept that the world has changed. The US is still the most powerful country on Earth, but it's not the only one. And in a multipolar world, the rules are different. The US can't impose its will. It has to negotiate. Now, what most people don't realize is that this Venezuelan submarine story isn't just about one rusty diesel boat, it's about the unraveling of an entire strategic framework. For decades, the US has operated under the assumption that its naval dominance in the Western Hemisphere was absolute. The Caribbean was an American lake. The Pacific approaches to Latin America were a US highway.
And the idea that a country like Venezuela, sanctioned, isolated, and economically gutted, could even think about challenging that dominance was laughable.
But here we are, watching a nation with a GDP smaller than Connecticut's play naval chess with the world's most powerful fleet.
Let me explain why this matters. The Caribbean isn't just a submarine. It's a symbol of something far more dangerous to US. The normalization of asymmetric resistance. Venezuela isn't trying to build a navy that can go toe-to-toe with the US Fifth Fleet. That would be suicidal.
Instead, it's doing what every smart underdog does: it's making itself a nuisance, a persistent irritant that raises the cost of American hegemony.
And in a multipolar world, that's often enough. Consider the numbers.
The US Navy has 11 aircraft carriers.
Venezuela has 1 submarine, and it might not even work.
But here's the uncomfortable: in the South China Sea, China has turned this exact strategy into an art form. They don't need to sink a carrier to make the US think twice about sailing one into contested waters.
They just need to make the cost of doing so unacceptably high. Venezuela is learning from that playbook. And if they succeed even partially, it sets a precedent. What happens when Nicaragua gets a few subs? Or Bolivia? Or, God forbid, a non-state actor? This is where the establishment narrative starts to crack.
The Pentagon will tell you that the Caribbean is a non-issue, that it's a relic, that the US could sink it with a single missile if it ever left port.
And they're not wrong. But that's not the point is that Venezuela is forcing the US to think about it. To deploy assets.
To run simulations.
To consider the political fallout of another military intervention in Latin America.
And every time the US has to divert attention to a country it would rather ignore, it's a win for Caracas. Now, let's talk about the broader military implications. The US Navy is built for blue water dominance, open oceans, carrier strike groups, power projection.
But the Caribbean isn't the open ocean.
It's a crowded, shallow, politically fraught theater where a single submarine can turn a routine patrol into a diplomatic crisis.
The Caribbean might not be able to sink a destroyer, but it doesn't need to. All it needs to do is lurk.
And in those waters, lurking is enough to force the US to change its behavior.
This is the same dynamic we saw in the Black Sea during the Ukraine war.
Russia's navy is a shadow of what it once was, but it still managed to turn the Sea of Azov into a no-go zone for Ukrainian shipping. Not because it could win a fleet battle, but because the mere presence of Russian warships made the cost of operating there too high.
Venezuela is trying to do the same thing in its own backyard.
And if it works, it's a template for every other country that wants to push back against US power.
Here's another angle: most analysts, the Caribbean isn't just a military asset. It's a bargaining chip. Venezuela knows the US doesn't want a war.
It knows that every time the Caribbean leaves port, it becomes a media spectacle, a propaganda victory for Maduro, and a headache for Washington.
So what does Venezuela do? It uses the submarine as leverage.
It hints at joint patrols with Russia.
It suggests it might sell the technology to Iran. It turns a piece of scrap metal into a geopolitical weapon. And that's the real danger.
The US has spent the last 30 years fighting wars in the Middle East and Central Asia, where the rules of engagement were clear.
But in Latin America, the rules are different.
The US can't just bomb Caracas into submission.
It can't impose a no-fly zone. It can't even enforce a blockade without triggering a regional backlash. So what's left? Sanctions that don't work. Diplomatic pressure that's ignored.
And the slow, creeping realization that the US is losing its grip on its own hemisphere.
Let me give you a historical parallel.
In the 1980s, the US faced a similar challenge with Nicaragua. The Sandinistas weren't a military threat, but they were a political one. So the US armed the Contras, mined Nicaraguan harbors, and tried to strangle the country economically. It worked for a while. But in the end, the Sandinistas survived, and the US was left with a black eye. Fast forward to today, and we're seeing the same playbook, but with a twist.
Venezuela isn't just surviving, it's adapting. It's finding new ways to punch above its weight. And the Caribbean is just the latest example. So what does this mean for US strategy? It means the old playbook is obsolete. You can't sanction your way to dominance. You can't bomb your way to influence.
And you can't ignore a country just because it's small. Venezuela is proving that even a broken nation can be a thorn in the side of a superpower.
And if the US doesn't adjust, it's going to keep getting pricked.
Now, I'm not saying the Caribbean is going to change the world.
It's not.
But it's a symptom of a much larger shift, one where the US can no longer take its dominance for granted.
And that's the real story here.
Not the submarine itself, but what at the slow, grinding erosion of American unipolarity in its own backyard.
Here's the uncomfortable: the Caribbean isn't just a problem for the US Navy, it's a problem for the entire Venezuelan political establishment, and that makes it far more dangerous.
Most analysts look at this submarine and see a military asset, but I see something else: a domestic power play wrapped in nationalist theater, one that could either stabilize Maduro's regime or accelerate its collapse. And the difference between those two outcomes might come down to how Washington decides to respond.
Let me explain why this matters. Since 2019, when Juan Guaidó declared himself interim president with US backing, Venezuela's opposition has been trapped in a paradox.
They'd had the moral high ground, international recognition, and even control of billions in frozen assets abroad.
But they've lacked one critical: the ability to actually govern.
Maduro, meanwhile, has clung to power through a mix of repression, economic warfare, and sheer institutional inertia. The Caribbean changes that calculus not because it's a game-changing weapon, but because it gives Maduro a narrative of strength at a moment when his regime is at its most vulnerable.
Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's military isn't a monolith.
The high command is a mix of ideologues, pragmatists, and opportunists, all of whom have spent the last decade profiting from the country's collapse through smuggling, corruption, and control of key industries.
The Caribbean isn't just a submarine, it's a loyalty test.
By flaunting this project, Maduro is telling the stick with me, and I'll give you a seat at the table in a new era of Venezuelan power. That's why you saw Defense Minister Vladimir Padrino Lopez standing next to the submarine in those propaganda photos, looking like a man who just won the lottery. He knows that if the regime can sell this as a victory, it buys them time, maybe even another election cycle.
But here's the Caribbean is also a hostage to Venezuela's economic reality.
The country's GDP has contracted by over 75% since 2013.
Its oil production, once the lifeblood of the economy, is now lower than it was in the 1940s.
The government can barely pay its soldiers, let alone fund a submarine program.
So where's the money coming from?
Some of it is likely Russian and Iranian investment, but a lot of it is probably being siphoned from the very same state coffers that are supposed to be feeding the population. That's why you're seeing food shortages spike again in Caracas, because every bolivar spent on the Caribbean is a bolivar not spent on imports or social programs.
This is where the domestic politics get really ugly.
The opposition, for all its flaws, still has a base of support among the urban middle class and the poorest Venezuelans who've been hit hardest by the crisis. If Maduro can't deliver on his promises, if the Caribbean turns out to be a white elephant, or if the US finds a way to neutralize it without triggering a regional backlash, then the military's patience might wear thin.
We've seen this movie before. In 1992, Hugo Chavez tried to overthrow Carlos Andrés Pérez with a coup.
In 2002, the military briefly turned on Chavez before rallying behind him.
The difference now is that Maduro doesn't have Chavez's charisma or his oil windfall. He's running on fumes. So let's game out the scenarios.
The most likely outcome is that the Caribbean becomes a permanent fixture of Venezuelan propaganda, a symbol of defiance that Maduro trots out whenever he needs to distract from economic misery. The US will impose more sanctions, maybe even designate Venezuela as a state sponsor of terrorism. The submarine will never see combat, but it will serve its keeping the generals in line and the opposition off balance.
But there are two wildcards that could change everything. The first is Russia.
If Moscow decides to turn Venezuela into a forward operating base for its own submarine patrols, something it's already hinted at, then the Caribbean stops being a Venezuelan problem and becomes a NATO problem. Imagine a Russian Kilo-class sub lurking in the Caribbean, just a few hundred miles from Florida. That's not just a military threat, it's a political one, because it forces the US to either escalate or look weak.
And in an election year, that's a recipe for overreaction. The second wildcard is the Venezuelan people.
Right now, most of them are too exhausted to care about a submarine. But if the economy collapses again, if hyperinflation returns, if the blackouts get worse, then even the military might start looking for an exit.
And that's when things get really dangerous.
A coup in Venezuela wouldn't be a clean transition to democracy.
It would be a free-for-all, with factions of the military, the opposition, and the cartels all vying for control.
And in that chaos, the Caribe could become a bargaining chip or a target.
Here's the bottom: the Caribe isn't just a military asset. It's a political time bomb.
It's Maduro's way of saying, I'm still in charge, and I've got friends in high places. But it's also a reminder of how fragile his grip on power really is. The US can't afford to ignore this, but it also can't afford to overreact. The old playbook, sanctions, isolation, regime change fantasies, hasn't worked. What's needed is a strategy that recognizes Venezuela for what it is: a failing state with just enough leverage to make life miserable for Washington, but not enough power to actually threaten it.
And that's the real tragedy.
Because at the end of the day, the Caribe isn't going to change the balance of power in the Caribbean.
But it might just change the balance of power in Venezuela, and that could be far more dangerous. Now, what most people don't realize is that this entire situation, Maduro's submarine, the US Navy's posturing, the Russian whispers in the background, isn't just about Venezuela.
It's about the unraveling of the post-Cold War order in the Western Hemisphere, and Washington's inability to adapt.
For decades, the US treated Latin America as a backyard, not a battleground.
But the Caribe's existence is proof that the backyard is now a front yard, and the neighbors are getting bolder. Let me explain why this matters beyond the headlines.
The US has spent the last 30 years obsessing over the Middle East, then pivoting to Asia, while assuming Latin America would just stay quiet. But Venezuela's defiance isn't an anomaly. It's part of a pattern.
Look at Nicaragua's growing ties with Iran, Cuba's stubborn survival despite 6 decades of sanctions, or even Mexico's quiet but real shift toward non-alignment under AMLO.
These aren't isolated cases. They're symptoms of a region that's tired of being taken for granted.
Here's the uncomfortable: the US still thinks in terms of containment, but the world has moved on to something far messier: competition without rules. The Caribe isn't a Soviet-style missile crisis. It's a 21st century hybrid, part military, part economic, part psychological.
And the US doesn't have a doctrine for it.
The Pentagon's playbook is built for peer adversaries like China or Russia, not for a bankrupt petrostate with a single submarine and a knack for chaos. That's why every time Maduro does something like this, Washington flails between indifference and overreaction. Take the last time Venezuela tried to flex its military muscle. In 2020, Maduro sent a naval flotilla to the disputed waters off Guyana, testing the US response. The Trump administration, fresh off its maximum pressure campaign, sent a carrier strike group to the region. The message was, don't push us. But the problem with that kind of signaling is that it assumes the other side cares about deterrence.
Maduro doesn't.
He cares about survival.
And if survival means provoking the US just enough to keep his generals loyal, then that's what he'll do. So what's the grand strategy here?
The US has 3 broad options, none of them great. The first is the status sanctions, occasional shows of force, and a quiet hope that Venezuela collapses under its own weight. The problem with this approach is that it's been tried for 2 decades, and all it's done is impoverish millions of Venezuelans while entrenching the regime. The second option is a more aggressive push for regime change, covert support for the opposition, cyber operations, even a limited military intervention. But that's a gamble with no guarantee of success.
Look at Libya. Look at Iraq.
The US has a terrible track record of turning failed states into stable democracies. The third option, and the one I think is most likely, if only because it's the least bad, is containment with engagement. That means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere soon, but working to limit his ability to cause trouble. It means reviving diplomatic channels, offering sanctions relief in exchange for concessions, and quietly pressuring Russia and China to stop propping him up. It also means investing in the region, not just in military bases, but in economic alternatives to Chinese loans and Russian arms deals.
Now, I know what some of you are engagement with Maduro? After everything he's done? And I get it. But here's the thing about Grand, it's not about morality. It's about interests. And right now, the US interest isn't in toppling Maduro. It's in preventing Venezuela from becoming a permanent Russian or Chinese outpost in the Caribbean. That's a lower bar, but it's also a more realistic one. The bigger question is whether the US can even do this. The American political system is terrible at long-term thinking, especially when it comes to foreign policy. Every 4 years, a new administration comes in and tears up the old playbook. Trump scrapped Obama's opening to Cuba. Biden reversed Trump's Venezuela policy. Who knows what the next president will do? Meanwhile, Maduro has been in power for a decade, and he's outlasted 3 US presidents. That's not because he's a genius. It's because he's playing a different game, one where the rules are survival, not stability. And that brings me to the final, uncomfortable reality. The Caribbean isn't just a submarine. It's a symbol of how the world has changed, and how the US hasn't. For all its military might, Washington is still thinking in 20th century terms: bases, alliances, deterrence. But the threats of the 21st century aren't just about tanks and missiles. They're about failed states, transnational crime, and the slow erosion of American influence. The Caribbean is a reminder that in this new world, even a single submarine can be a geopolitical earthquake. So where does that leave us? With a choice. The US can keep pretending that Venezuela is a problem to be solved, or it can accept that it's a reality to be managed. It can keep reacting to Maduro's provocations, or it can start shaping the environment around him. And most importantly, it can keep treating Latin America as an afterthought, or it can recognize that the region is where the next great power competition will play out, not with armies, but with debt, drugs, and disinformation. The Caribbean won't sink the US Navy. But it might just sink the last remnants of American hegemony in its own hemisphere. And that, more than any submarine, is the real threat.